If you're living with the outdated look of popcorn ceilings, I've got good news for you. Going from a popcorn ceiling to a smooth, updated, flat ceiling may be easier than you think, and the results can be stunning. A word of caution here. Asbestos was used in popcorn ceilings until the early 1980s. So if you have any concerns regarding your ceiling, contact your local building department and they'll tell you how to proceed. When a popcorn ceiling isn't painted, simply misting it with water and using a large drywall taping knife easily removes a popcorn ceiling. Removing a popcorn ceiling with numerous coats of paint on it is a lot more challenging, and that's exactly what we have here. The ceilings in my home have at least 8 coats of paint on them, the first 4 being oil-based paint and the next 4 water-based paint. How do I know that? I put those 8 coats of paint on the ceiling myself over the years we've lived here. You've heard the term used when people talk about covering up a popcorn ceiling. But what is skim coating? Skim coating is simply applying a single or multiple thin coats of diluted drywall joint compound over an existing ceiling or wall in order to flatten, level, or improve the look of the surface, and that's exactly what I'll be doing here, skim coating the ceiling. I sectioned off a test area of the ceiling with painter's tape, and using a pump sprayer filled with warm water, I sprayed the ceiling until it started to drip on the tarp that I had placed below this area. After waiting approximately 30 minutes, I used a 12-inch drywall taping knife and started scraping the test area. Did the popcorn slide off with ease? No, not at all, but some did, which is what I expected. I scraped off what I could, then sprayed the ceiling again, waited another 30 minutes and scraped a second time. Now the popcorn came off a lot easier. The second application of water did the trick, and I now know what it's going to take to remove this popcorn. My method of attack is to wet the ceiling once, wait 30 minutes and scrape. Wet the ceiling again, wait another 30 minutes and scrape a second time. Doing this, I easily managed to scrape 150 square feet of popcorn ceiling in a few short hours, working either from the floor or standing on a folding work platform. An inexpensive blue tarp laying on the floor caught all the wet popcorn, and the ceiling was left to dry overnight. There is another way of getting to this stage of popcorn removal, and that's to either rent or purchase an electric drywall sander attached to a HEPA vacuum. This method doesn't require spraying and scraping, but it can be tough on your shoulders depending on the size of the ceiling you're trying to flatten. With the ceiling dry, it's ready for the next step, and that's a quick sanding with 80 grit paper to knock off any high spots, loose paint, and to make sure the corners and edges of the ceiling are smooth. I have to sand the ceiling several times, so efficient and dust-free sanding are a must. There are several ways to sand drywall. Some can be difficult and dusty, while others can be easy and dust-free. The 3 drywall sanders you see here are from left to right what I would classify as good, better, and best. The one on the left is the one I started out with years ago, available everywhere, but for the inexperienced user, the sanding head has a nasty habit of flipping over against the wall, leaving an ugly scar that usually needs to be repaired. The middle sander, known as the Radius 360, uses a round foam-backed pad with 9-inch hook and loop paper, has a swivel head and a no-flip design that I've used for years. But the ultimate hand sander is the one on the far right. It is the Radius 360 Air that comes with the rectangular Flex Air corner and detail sander. With all the same great features as the Radius 360, the lightweight Radius 360 Air adds efficient dust collection to an already proven sander. Coupled with the rectangular Flex Air detail sander, sanding this ceiling was easily and virtually dust-free. Without a doubt, this is my go-to drywall sander, bar none. A quick sanding with 80 grit paper of both the field of the ceiling and the edges is followed up by a thorough vacuuming to remove any unwanted dust and small particles. Now the ceiling is ready for drywall mud. Choosing from a myriad of drywall compounds, or mud as it's commonly called, is confusing for the novice, but it doesn't need to be. There are 2 basic types of drywall compound: pre-mixed, that comes in a bucket or a box, and setting type compound, which comes as a dry powder in a bag that you mix with water. The setting type is not recommended by the manufacturer for skim coating. If this type of compound is used and it dries before it can chemically set, bond failure may result. I've always gravitated to two types of pre-mixed drywall mud: all-purpose, packed in a box or a bucket, and all-purpose light, which is sold locally in a box. The standard all-purpose compound has more adhesive in it than other muds. It is perfect for a first coat and is recommended by the manufacturer for skim coating. The all-purpose light shrinks less than other muds and is easier to sand. The all-purpose mud is much too thick to apply to the ceiling right out of the box or bucket and must be thinned down with water. I've placed some mud in a plastic pail and I'll slowly add water while I mix it with a drill and a mixing paddle. I prefer these types of mixing paddle because they don't cut into the sides of the bucket, leaving you with shards of plastic in the mud. With the mud now the consistency of thick yogurt, it's ready to be applied to the ceiling. Using a 19mm roller insert on a painter's pole, I can now roll the mud onto the ceiling. If I've mixed the mud too thin, I can always add more mud to the mix to thicken it up and more water if it needs to be thinned down. Mud can be applied to the ceiling using a roller, and then a knife is used to spread the mud out evenly, or mud can be applied to the periphery of the ceiling first using a 12-inch taping knife, and then the area can be filled in with a roller. I usually work in manageable 4-foot by 4-foot sections at a time. Once the area is filled in with mud using the roller, I simply take the 12-inch drywall knife and smooth out the surface, always looking to leave a flat, uniform thickness of mud without any grooves, voids, or raised edges. It takes a bit of time to get the hang of doing this, and that's why it's a good idea to work in smaller areas when you start. I'm not looking to leave a 1/4 inch of mud on the ceiling. I'm working towards covering up all the voids and rough areas with a thin layer of mud by proceeding slowly and methodically to achieve that smooth, flat surface, remembering that this is the first of 2 coats. Once you get the hang of it, you can start to move at a faster pace. Here my son Matthew and I move right along. I mud the periphery and he rolls the mud onto the main body of the ceiling. I'll then smooth out that section and move on. This is the same procedure I've used countless times on different jobs. The following day, the first coat of mud was dry, so I sanded the ceiling with 120 grit sandpaper to knock down any high spots, ridges, or bumps that occurred during the mudding process. Applying the second coat of mud is the exact same procedure as applying the first coat, with one exception. I've now mixed up a batch of all-purpose light instead of the regular all-purpose mud I used on the first coat. The reason is, the all-purpose light sands a lot easier than the all-purpose mud while still having good adhesion properties. I'll be sanding this coat with a much finer grit paper, so an easier to sand mud works best. I take my time applying the second coat, making sure I'm not leaving any ridges or voids. If I'm careful and methodical with my knife work here, sanding this coat will be easy. After the second coat dries, I sand the entire ceiling with 220 grit sandpaper. Sanding with a coarser grit sandpaper can leave nasty scratches behind that can be seen after painting, so prior to painting, I sand with 220 grit sandpaper. Once the ceiling is sanded, I give it a thorough vacuuming to remove any dust. Inspecting the ceiling before priming is critical. If I've made any mistakes like leaving a void, bump, or pinholes, they need to be addressed before priming. One of the easiest ways to identify mistakes in the ceiling is by using a strong light source. Holding the light so that it rakes across the ceiling and using a soft pencil to lightly mark the offending mistakes is an easy way of identifying areas that need to be touched up. With the mistakes identified, I'm ready to fill the voids and pinholes with all-purpose light mud. No need to thin it down this time. I just give it a good mix before use. There is, however, one little problem. Patching the pinholes with white drywall compound onto a pure white ceiling will make identifying the patches almost impossible to identify when the mud is dry and it's time to sand them. The solution is to color the drywall compound, so when the compound dries, I can see where the patches are I need to lightly sand. I use blue chalk-lined powder to color the compound to make these patches easier to see. Simply mix in a small amount of chalk-lined powder into the mud and patch the voids and pinholes. When the mud dries, I know exactly where I need to lightly sand, and a good drywall primer easily covers the remaining blue tint. There is another method of replacing a popcorn ceiling with a smooth flat ceiling, and this small hallway is the perfect place to demonstrate it. Although this method is commonly used on fine-grained popcorn ceilings, It's not impossible to use this method to flatten a coarse-grained popcorn ceiling. It just takes more coats of mud. I add just a little bit of water to a batch of all-purpose mud and mix it well. Not to thin the mud per se, I just want a well-mixed mud that applies smoothly with a 12-inch drywall knife. A thicker mud and not a yogurt consistency mud is what I want to apply. The less water in this coat of mud, the better, because this mud has a tendency to shrink when it dries, and the more it shrinks, the more coats of mud it'll take to cover this coarse popcorn. After the first coat of mud is dry, I apply a second coat of all-purpose mud without sanding between coats. When the second coat is dry, I'll lightly sand with 120 grit sandpaper, vacuum the ceiling, and apply the third coat, which is a coat of all-purpose light mud. When that coat dries, I'll sand with 220 grit sandpaper and inspect for any voids, pinholes, and proceed by filling any irregularities with blue mud. A final sanding and it's time to prime and paint. A ceiling with fine-grained popcorn usually takes 2 coats of mud, but this ceiling's popcorn is coarse. That's why 3 coats of mud were needed. With the ceilings, walls, and trim painted, this project is now complete. The thought of the work involved and any inconvenience this project may have caused soon vanish when you gaze upon a new, smooth, flat ceiling. I hope this video has inspired you to update your popcorn ceilings. Perhaps a good place to start is the bedroom closet. It's small, manageable, and out of the way. For Canadian Woodworking and Home Improvement Magazine, I'm Gord Graff. Thanks for watching.